Hello and welcome back to this video number 5 on identity access management. As I have talked in the first video, this video would be revolving around role-based access control, pretty much defining access to resources, services that you would be or your consumers would be leveraging within your cloud. So it's a very important topic. And if you have not watched my earlier videos like video 1, video 2, video 3, video 4, it is strongly recommended that you watch those videos, because then it would be easy flow of ideas when we get into the video 5 and then following the video 6. So the concepts that we would experience in this particular video, especially for the role-based access control, would be carried forward into video 6, which would be identity governance, revolving around privilege identity management and entitlement management, which would be again a very exciting video. So this video would be important to understand in that light. So without any further ado, let's dive into that. What are the topics that we will be covering in this presentation? So at a very high level, we'll talk about zero trust architecture. The reason that we want to discuss zero trust architecture is this RBAC model addresses one of the core principal component or foundational pillar of zero trust architecture. So this is where it is worth mentioning. Obviously, we're not going to go into all the details around zero trust architecture. That would require a separate video, and hopefully if time permits, I would come out with that. We'll be defining the Azure AD role-based access control. We'll talk about Azure resource-based access control, role-based access control, and try to differentiate the confusion that many of us have between Azure AD roles and Azure resource roles, right? So that's the overarching goal. And let's move into the zero trust architecture. You might have heard about it multiple times. I might not go into absolute detail of this zero trust here in this video, because this series is already very long, and I probably would come out with deploying the zero trust architecture for Microsoft Azure and Office 365 in a separate video. But before we actually go into the actual authorization, it is important to understand that when you architect your authorization model, you have to keep your zero trust architecture upmost in your mind. So this is our starting point before we talk authorization. And the fundamentals, or the basic 3 principles for zero trust are obviously the least privilege, which is what we are going to just discuss shortly, and that goes without saying, right? You provide the least privilege model and give it the least possible access to your environment. Use the concept of just in-time administration as well as just enough administration, JIT and JEA, right? So only give the very minimalistic rights to the user. That's the just enough administration. And then JIT is just give it for a very minimalistic time. So the user does not need to have rights for all the time, right? Shorter the duration is, the shorter is the attack surface attack area, right? So this is a very important concept when you start working on authorization, because authentication is done and authorization could also cause a lot of problems, even if your authentication is secure. The second part is the assumed breaches, because no matter how secure your environment is and how well you architect and design it, there are always possibility of breach, right? By the lateral movement, or by a network or user devices changing in the landscape, the applications changes, the platform changes, the devices changes. So it is always good to assume that the breaches may happen no matter how secure you did. Maybe you are secure here today, but down the road in 2 months, 3 months, things have changed, and now your security is at breach, right? So that's why assumed breaches means that you have to be always vigilant, agile, and keep assessing your environment periodically. Do your pen test and stress test and all that, so that you're secure enough. And verify explicitly is always authenticate and authorize, right? Authentication we discussed in the first part of the second video and third video. Now always authenticate and authorize based on all available data points, whether it's a user identity, location, device, health, data classification, and anomalies, right? So these are the three fundamentals of zero trust which should be in uppermost in your mind when you're talking about authentication and authorization. So before we start talking about actual RBAC and authorization, we just need to establish that what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to authorize? And when you are in your operations, there are multiple different types of operations that you are responsible to, or you are responsible for managing and administering it, right? These operations could be a variety of tasks that could be summarized into multiple sections. So let's just start talking about one of the operations that a very high level operation would be to manage identities, right? Which is what we have talked about. We have talked about authentication, but now we need to manage identities. When we say manage identities, managing users, their password, their login, their lockouts, adding them to the groups, giving them the appropriate rights to do all that work, right? That's all identity related work. And where are our identities stored for Azure and Office 365? We have been talking for last 3 videos continuously. That is all in Azure Active Directory. So basically, when we talk about authorization, first thing that should pop up here in mind that, okay, I'm storing all my identities in Azure Active Directory. I should have some kind of a model here that would allow me or my organization to operate efficiently, effectively, securely, and also allow me to adhere to the compliance requirement while I'm managing my identities, right? You do it, most of us have been doing it in on-prem regularly. Now the question is that how do we manage it in on-prem? The scope has changed, the business requirement has changed, the landscape has changed as soon as you move into the cloud, because now your audience could be unlimited, the threat vector could be unlimited. You are doing something in the cloud, which is a public cloud pretty much, or you may be in a hybrid cloud situation. So basically, that is why it is very important to understand that what kind of authorization we are going to do and what kind of a role-based access control we are going to do. So when we talk about managing your Azure Active Directory, right, or Azure Active Directory related task, that is controlled through Azure AD role-based access control or Azure AD RBAC. Now, obviously, this is the scope, right? So we need to understand the scope of this RBAC. The scope of the RBAC here is only the Azure Active Directory, because this is Azure AD RBAC. Now, when you start going into the Azure tenant and start looking into and working with resources, whether it's a VM, whether it's a storage, functions, Kubernetes services, networking, VNet, blah, 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 right? This is this ocean of services there. So you should ask this question, would my Azure AD RBAC would work there? Absolutely not, because that's a very different area, right? So if you have a rights given to you in your Azure Active Directory, that is specifically done to manage the Azure Active Directory related operational activities or tasks. That has nothing to do with Azure resources, right? We need to establish this fact very, very clear, and I would demonstrate you shortly what I'm talking about, because I have seen coming in, IT administrators coming to me and asking me questions. Hey, I'm a global administrator, but why can't I just create a VM in my Azure tenant, right? And that is self-explanatory, because by being a global admin, right, you are the boss as far as the Azure Active Directory is concerned. You can do anything and everything you like to do in Azure Active Directory, but that does not give you the privilege in your Azure tenant to create resources or delete resources or do anything about it, right? And that has been a question that has been asked multiple times to me. And the reason is that this segregation of this RBAC between Azure Active Directory and Azure resource have not been very well defined and very well discussed, right? So my objective here is to clarify that and make this absolutely clear that by giving and assigning somebody a role in Azure Active Directory RBAC or Azure Active Directory, would not give you the privileges in Azure resources. That has to be dealt separately. So that's the first part of it, the RBAC. First operational activity. First, when you start looking into RACI, I think I should have brought the RACI model here too. Now the second activity that you are looking into, where you have to, from operational perspective, where you need to authorize people to do certain tasks, is your Azure. And as I already said, Azure is an ocean of services. I think, I don't remember exactly, there are almost 64,000 types of different resources if I recall correctly. So that's an ocean of services, and you need to manage that operations effectively, follow the least privilege model to follow your zero trust architecture. And how do you do that? So there is a separate Azure resource RBAC model. We will discuss that too, right? That is an Azure RBAC model. Now within the Azure RBAC, you may also be running variety of different applications. For an example, you may be running Azure Kubernetes services, right? You need to have an RBAC for that. You may be running MySQL there as a SQL database, and that you need an RBAC for that. You may be running a SQL database. You may be running Postgre, right? All these other COTS applications that you're bringing, they also require their individual RBAC. So when we talk about role-based access control, it's just not limited here to one area or one operational activity. Depending on your environment and what services you're using, the authorization model, which revolves around the role-based access control model, RBAC, would vary, right? Some people may not be using Kubernetes services. Another organization may be using Kubernetes services. So now the requirement from operations perspective has changed. You may have to configure an AKS RBAC, Azure Kubernetes Services RBAC. How you do that? That's a very different discussion. Now, some customers may be using MySQL. Other customer may not be using MySQL. You need to worry about that, and the model would keep changing. So that's the reason this area is too large to control here. And until unless you have a finite operational model, it would be very, very difficult to come out with the RBAC. That's why most of the organizations struggle, right? And with this RBAC model. So we'll talk about and we'll try to help you as much as possible. But again, you have to relate to your individual environment when we talk about authorization and when we talk about authorization through RBAC model, right? So I just want to establish that. So if I can summarize here, at the very minimalistic point, you have an Azure AD RBAC, you have a Azure RBAC, which is Azure Resource RBAC, and then you have RBAC for a variety of other applications and database that you may or may not be running. You might have Kubernetes RBAC required, you might have MySQL RBAC required, you might need a SQL RBAC required, Postgre RBAC required, depending on what services you are using and leveraging, right? So that is in a nutshell. So let's just first try to explain you the difference between the Azure AD roles and Azure roles, Azure resource roles. So I'm gonna pause it here and go into my lab to show you and demonstrate the difference right here. So folks, I'm logged into my Azure portal. This is the same Azure portal and Active Directory environment that we have been using for all our previous videos too, video 1, video 2, video 3. So you should be familiar with this. And in this case, I'm going to go to my Azure Active Directory. Now, in Azure Active Directory, when I click on this roles and administrator, these are specifically Azure Active Directory roles. The scope of these roles is only around Azure Active Directory, not around Azure resources. So just by assigning a role here on this interface, on these roles enumerated and listed over here, users are not going to get rights into the Azure resources. So let's just prove my point here. Global Administrator is the most powerful role for Azure Active Directory. There's only one account, that is me right now, that has been given the Global Administrator right. We will talk about best practices and other stuff when we go to the security video, but let's not go there. What I'm going to try to do here, I'm going to add one guy here, which is Chris White. I'm not going to add this because if you were in my last video, we have configured the ADFS for single sign-on, and we have not decided to use ADFS for external at this point. So this guy cannot come from outside world, and I'm not going to use this. But this is a cloud only identity, and I can definitely try this guy. So if I add the Chris here, now the Chris is added from into this global administrator. So basically Chris has all the rights to do and manage the Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, for the lack of better words, right? Now, by allowing Chris into a global administrator, should he has the rights on Azure resources? No, because the scope here is only Azure Active Directory. So let's try to see what implication it has. So if I can go into another incognito window and try to log in as, what was his account, as Chris ID? Hold on, I just need to see Chris. Okay. So if I go ahead and try to log in as Chris, it might ask me to change the password if I remember correctly, or maybe not. Yeah. Alright, I have not turned the MFA. That's our security video coming shortly. Alright, so if I go to the Azure Active Directory, he is a global admin. Can he create a new user and modify group membership and all? Yes, of course, he should be able to do that. Let's just wait for a few seconds. Can he create a new user? Yes, he can create it, he can invite it, which we have been demonstrating it because he is a global admin, right? No big deal. Now, if I go here and go to the resource groups here, does he have any right? He don't have, he has zero rights here. He's a global admin, he can't do anything here. Can he create even a resource group? He doesn't even have the read rights, so that he cannot even see what is there in your Azure tenant. So the point that I was trying to make, which many people has confusion, I run it in this scenario very often, that by having a rights as a global administrator or by having an Azure Active Directory rights, you will have the rights in the Azure resources. No, that's not true, because the scope is different. The Azure Active Directory roles or RBAC is only for Azure Active Directory, and in order to allow him to have the rights into the resources, you have to give the rights on the Azure, right? So let's try to do this. I'm gonna get out of here and go back into this gentleman, Chris White, and try to give him some rights through Azure RBAC. So let's say if I go to, I'm gonna give him rights on subscription just for the sake. So we have this subscription here, which I just created a few minutes back, and I go to the access control IAM. This is Azure RBAC, different than Azure AD RBAC, right? If I have the rights because I'm logged in here as an admin, and I can add here, and I can add a role assignment, and now I assign the contributor rights to Chris. Right, and then you can see that Chris has been given rights here. How we do that, what we do that, what's the best practices, we'll talk later. What we are trying to establish here to make sure that people understand the difference between Azure AD roles and Azure roles, right? This is a Azure role. The contributor role is an Azure role. It's not a Azure Active Directory role. So if I go back now and try to log back into as Chris, then I should be able to create resources, because now he has been given rights through Azure RBAC. See, now he said $200 credit left, and you can create a resource group. And he can create, right? So he was able to see the old resource group, and also he was able to create a new resource group. So now he has the right. So the point that I made earlier, that you people should be, and if you know it, very, very, very good. So you understand now, by default, the global admins do not have the rights on the Azure resources, right? We have shown you, you have seen it with your own eyes, but there is a kind of a workaround or a backdoor that you should also be aware of. And that is also one of the reasons that you should not add multiple members into the global admin role, because if that global admin wants, he can himself activate the access to all resources in all subscriptions and all management group just by going to the Azure Active Directory property. He can do that, and you might not even know that, because you as an Azure administrator has not assigned him a role, or assigned a RBAC role on Azure resources. But as a global admin, he can activate himself, right? Let me show you what I mean to say here, right? So for an example, what I did here in our lab, that I added one user into a global admin role. Let me show you quickly. And I added it through the PIM process. What happened? Oh, I'm looking into the group settings. Sorry. How could it happen? Alright, so we are looking into the global admin. Sorry guys. And I added Bobby Malik through the PIM process, which is our next video. And he has now been given a global admin right? Now Bobby as such should not have any rights to anywhere in the environment, right? So if I go to the subscription layer, Bobby should not have any rights. And I can check it quickly. And Bobby has 0 rights here, right? Perfect. Now, as Bobby has the global admin rights, and supposedly he logs in as Bobby. If I'm logged in here as a Bobby, yep. And what he could do here is he could go to Azure Active Directory. He's a global admin, right? He has the rights. And he can go to the properties, and he can very easily, I can bring this up here. He can do access management for Azure resources. And if he wants, Bobby Malik can manage access to all Azure subscriptions and management group in this tenant, right? You can just say yes, and he's good to go. And you may not even know it unless somebody tells you, or you find in your auditing and monitoring that this particular global admin actually has access to all your resources, right? So let's try to do that. And he can click yes, and he can click save. Now what happened with this, that in the background, this user account has been added to a user access administrator Azure role, not Azure AD role. I'm gonna show you momentarily here. Let me sign off from here 1 minute to make sure that he has all the rights now. And you remember that I showed you he had no rights. Now I'm gonna log back again. And now if he goes to the subscription, look here what happened. And view my access, he has the user access administrator, which is what I mentioned, right? And it is inherited. It's going to go all the way down. Now it is applied at the tenant layer, this particular role, right? So it's very, if you want to remove this whole assignment of the user access administrator to at the tenant layer, that's where you will have to run through a PowerShell. You would probably do not want to do that, right? Because reason, I'll tell you why. It is going to be very complicated to unassign this role at the root level. This is no easy task. This is very complicated. Now, why it's going to be important for you is to understand this problem here, right? So once he does that, not only he has rights, now he can create anything. Pretty much he has the rights to add the role assignment, right? So if I want to go here and add a reader right, and I want to add this JSON guy here, I want to give him rights. See here, not only he can create resources, but he's pretty much the owner for all practical purposes. He's pretty much the owner on every single resource subscription management group. So it's massive. Understand the importance of it, right? Now, having said that, why this would be a challenge, or why this could become a challenge, because as you as a user cannot disable it. It is only Bobby who can go ahead and he can go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to go back and hey, I should not have done that. I should have asked my organization or company, but I did that. Now, in order to undo it, it is Bobby only who can do undo it, not you. And he can do undo it, but he will not have the option to do that. And if somehow this user has gone or has left the organization, this is going to haunt you, right? Because you have no way to get here and get rid of this permission. This will haunt you. This will keep showing you an audit report. If that user is present, you can ask him to disable it. But if he is left the organization and that account is still, the account would still not be able to remove it very easily because this is tied up here, right? So this could get complicated, and that's what I want to explain you, right? I hope this makes sense. So there is a backdoor for global admin to have access to all Azure resources. In general, by default, they don't, but if they know that backdoor here, they can do that. That's all I wanted to tell you as one of the caveat or exception to all what we talked for last 10-15 minutes. Any further into that. So let's go back and start talking about our roles again. So if you look into this slide here, this is showing you all the Azure AD based roles. Basically, being a global administrator, I have the ability to assign different roles to different people. But different roles have different purposes here, right? So authentication administrator, this, I'm not going to read all that. But as a matter of best practices, you should not have more than one or two global admin, and all the membership of the global administrator, which is the most powerful account and most privileged account, should be managed through a least privilege access model following the zero trust through your privileged identity management solution, or PIM. The PIM, as we talked about, it goes back to the earlier videos that we talked about, requires an additional licensing, which would be P2 license, Azure Active Directory P2. So if you have not watched those first 3 videos, that's why it just goes back there, right? So please do watch them. Now, if you see here, depending on your operational model, depending on what your organizational structure is, you may have to distribute your different tasks to different sets, right? So for an example, you want to give a conditional access administrator just to manage the conditional access policies, right? You can give somebody the rights to the customer lockbox for access. But one of the things that is more important here, that if you want to go with the least privilege model, just in time and just enough administration model, then one of the roles that probably should be configured properly is the privilege role administrator, right? So there are two of them: privilege authentication administrator. This allows only to view and set and reset, and the privilege role administrator. Now, by doing the privilege role administrator, you can manage the role assignments in Azure AD and all aspects of privilege identity management. That could allow you, by adding them, though this is an Azure AD role, but by assigning this role to a user, that user may also be able to assign roles to the Azure resources too. So this is the only one that would be leveraged for Azure resources, right? By assigning somebody rights here, that particular user can assign roles in Azure. Rest all of them that is listed in this deck and that was shown up in the demo, they are only limited to Azure Active Directory. In addition to the built-in roles that you're seeing right on my screen right now, there is also a possibility of creating the custom roles. I have not seen many organizations creating these custom roles, but that gives you the option. The reason being that the built-in roles are generally enough for any organizational RACI and operational mode. So if you look into you have got all kind of roles already created for you. So most likely you may not need to create a new custom role, but I'll show you how easy it is. Application administrator, you have application developers, authentication administrator, Azure DevOps, AIP administrator, which is a very powerful solution. As I have mentioned, I have a very interesting video on Azure information protection. Then B2C, policy administrator. We talked about B2C in video 2, video 3. The billing administrator, cloud application administrator, cloud device administrator. So pretty much Microsoft has done a great job of giving you this built-in roles that should meet your organization requirement in general. Compliance administrator, compliance data administrator, right? Desktop analysis, directory readers, directory writers, dynamic 365, even all of the exchange administrator, right? And SharePoint administrator, Teams administrator, obviously the global administrator, global reader, which are the global administrator is the most powerful role. Group administrators, guest inviter, help desk administrator, inside administrators, right? So you have got all kinds of, if you see here, Power BI, printer, search administrator, search editor, security administrator, security operator. Now remember, the security administrator and security operator is only working in the Azure Active Directory scope. The security administrator role is not applicable, as I mentioned earlier, to the Azure resources. There is another role for Azure for security. Security operator, security readers, SharePoint administrator, Teams administrator. So you have got pretty much user administrator. Most likely what I have seen in past that customers use global administrator. Of course, the user administrators are used for managing user aspect, all aspect of users, including the access package that we are going to see in next video, right? And then they use the privilege identity privilege role administrator here. That's very often used. Then application roles are used very frequently. These are the commonly used roles by almost every organization. Azure information protection administrator is very important, commonly used role, right? Billing administrator is another one that people use often, very often, and most of the organization use that. Compliance administrator, of course, this is important. So pretty much it has got everything, right? Now when you say new custom role, you can just click on the new custom role and you can say whatever you want to name it, and then it gives you option to start from scratch, or you can clone it from a custom role, right? So let's say if you start with the scratch, you have all the options here. You can pick up what you want to do. Description actually helps you to do that, right? And once you do that, you can bundle these different ACLs which is the actual rights here, into one role. And once these apples are added to the role, your role is ready, right? We don't want to do that right now, but this is one of the options. Second important thing that I want to mention, which we would also be covering in our next identity governance section video, the next video, that because these are very important and critical privilege accounts and privilege roles here. So the recommended path here is that do not add and assign a member directly to these roles, and always use PIM. In fact, your security center would start complaining if you start assigning those roles directly once you have the PIM enabled, right? The reason being is that if you do not use the PIM, then you lose the fundamental of that zero trust architecture of least privilege model, because once you add it a user into this role, he or she is permanently added, and it cannot take the advantage of just-in-time administration. On the other hand, when you do it from privilege and identity management, then users have the time limit, right? They can use it for 4 hours and then they have to reactivate it. So it gives you the benefit of just-in-time administration and just enough administration if you use privilege identity management behind it. So except for keeping 1 or 2 accounts into the global administrator, which is a recommended practice in case something goes terribly wrong, then you should always use PIM to add users to this, assign these roles to the users, right? Do not directly assign these users. So we'll discuss that once we get into the PIM, but I definitely want to mention it right here. Now that covers of the Azure Active Directory roles, and then we need to talk about the Azure roles as well. So let me go there. So talking about Azure role-based access control, all the roles, instead of putting into a deck, I have given you the link here. This deck would be in the description for your reference. Now you can click here and you can find all the roles that built-in roles that Microsoft has provided to you. And by and large, these roles are enough and sufficient, or rather more than sufficient, for almost every single organization. In addition to that, as I have shown you that you can create a custom role for Azure Active Directory, you also have the option to create the custom roles in Azure too. Now the scope here changes, right? So when you start deploying the Azure RBAC, you can assign the RBAC roles, Azure RBAC roles, at the highest layer, which is the management groups, which is inherited down there, all the way down, right? So if you assign the role here, that means that role would be inherited by all the subscription, resource group, and resources. Or you could assign the role at the subscription layer, or you could assign the role at the resource group or individual resources too. So you have got plenty of scope area here that you could plan your RBAC model. And as I said, the management groups and Azure subscription, from RBAC perspective, the best practices should be very minimalistic, right? So you should not have a lot of people giving the rights at the management group and subscription layer, because that breaks the least privilege model, right? So you should be, as much as possible, you should be giving the least privilege model, you follow the least privilege model here. Now, in order to assign a role, pretty much you need to have the contributor rights on that resource. So, ownership, I'm so sorry. The contributor rights would not allow you to assign a role, so unless you have the owner role on that particular resource, you cannot assign a role. That's a requirement. But because we have PIM, you could actually bypass that by using the privilege identity management, and without giving them that rights, hopefully you should be able to configure and allow the users assign different roles, which we will see in the privilege identity management video, right? Which is identity governance video, which is just next video after that. So now, depending on this becomes a challenging situation, because each environment is different, each organization is different, and how do you come out with a RBAC model around Azure? Very hard to say depending on the organization, but I would suggest you the least privilege model that we talked about is the best way to go around it. I can share with you one sample template that I created for another customer momentarily, But before I go there, I just want to mm, try to put a different thought process in your mind when you define the Azure RBAC. So many of us, almost all of us, have experience of using on-prem environment, on-prem Active Directory, on-prem file servers, right? So when we define, just let's get out of this mindset from the cloud for a few minutes and get back to the a configuration on your file server. When you have to configure permissions or ACLs on your file servers or folders, what process you actually use. The recommended path is, which is referred to a terminology called as AGDLP, right? That's a Microsoft acronym, AGDLP. That's how we assign permission, and we should assign permissions on folder. What does it mean? So basically it says add users to the group, global groups, add global groups to the domain local groups, and assign permission to the domain local group. So that's the AGDLP abbreviation. What it really means in real world is practically that if you have a folder, for an example HR, before you start assigning permissions, you think about what are the different sets of permissions that you would need on this HR folder. And in most scenario, you will come out with an answer, hey, I need a read write, I need a read and write write, and I probably also need a full control write, right? You can go a little bit more granular, but at least these three comes to mind right away. And once you have that structure in your mind that, hey, I need three different sets of permissions or ACLs, you create three different domain local groups and call one group as an HR read, second HR read write, third call an HR full control. And only once in your life you give the permission on that folder and assign the HR read as a read write, HR read write as a read and write, and HR full control as a full control, and you're done. Your permissions are done. Down the road, you have the groups for each department. For an example, sales department group that you created, a global group, now that needs access to the HR folder and that needs a read access. You just add that group into the domain local group and good to go, right? And that's how you configure the folder permission. When we do RBAC here, my analogy is very simple. On each resource type that you have, you decide that what is your different sets of permission that you would need. And say for an example, on a resource group that has storage account, probably you would come out with a set of roles that you need obviously you need an ownership on that resource group, maybe you also need a contributor right on that resource group. You need a reader right on that resource group. You may also need storage related Azure roles. For example, a blob contributor, blob reader, the file share contributor. There are tons of storage built-in Azure RBAC roles, and you define that, hey, these are the different sets of different roles that I would need on this resource group, or on this particular resource, or on this management group, right, or on this subscription. So you have to think and sit down, look into your operational model, go with the least privilege model, and come out with a plan and say, you know what, this is my least role-based access control model. Because organizations struggle with that in the vacuum of information and say, how do I do that? And I think without even going into what your RACI is, what your operational model is, if you follow this analogy, it might help you, because basically it gives you a basic fundamental structure and say, hey, I have a reader, I have a contributor, I have a owner, I have a storage block contributor, I have a storage account contributor, right? And you have that. And corresponding to that, you create an Azure Active Directory group. So for that resource group, you can create a group called as, if that resource group name is, for an example, dev1, right? Or sandbox 1, or whatever that application name is, or application 1, right? There's whatever the resource group name is, and based on that you can create an Azure AD group, not the group in your Active Directory. There is a reason that I'm asking you to consider that, right? So do not use the built-in AD group that you're seeking, rather use Azure Active Directory group, because down the road it would help you to create access package and help you with a self-service RBAC model. If you decide to use your Active Directory groups that are being synced to your Azure Active Directory, that might not work with access package, because there's no way that Azure can go and update that, right? So that's, we'll see in the access package, but that's the consideration here. So you create corresponding groups in your Azure Active Directory groups, cloud groups, not the on-prem Active Directory group, and assign that role on these resources upfront, and you're ready to go. Going forward, now if you have got different other group of users, you have got an application team or something, always try to assign permission to a group or assign a role to a group rather to an individual. That's the best practice, right? Because the individual users could be a real challenge. The groups is a better way to do that and minimize the implication security holes too. So you have a, for an example, hypothetically, you created a resource group called as a task. I created a 3 different Azure Active Directory group, which we can see shortly. And we can say, hey, test read, test contributor, test owner, right? And if you need to cover for a specific resource type, you can also have those roles too. You create those 3, at least those 3 groups, assign those 3 groups the required role, the reader, owner, and contributor role on that resource group, and then you could add the users or the groups into that group, right? That's very simple to do that. And or you could use the access package down the road, right? So I'm saying a mouthful here, I don't know if it's making sense. Let's do it in the lab so that you can understand it. So I am at my tenant here, Azure portal, and I have got 2 resource group, new and test. There's no resources right now. So let's say I decide on my test, I would have 3 different roles. One is the ownership, one is the contributor, and one is the read, right? That's a bare minimum. So what I will do here to start with, I'll go to the Azure Active Directory and I will create a group here, right? This group is a sync group. So this is what I was talking about. This has been synced from on-prem Active Directory, and I don't want to use that. Remember that anything that has been synced from Active Directory, with whether an Active Directory account or group, you cannot modify that in cloud. It has to be modified on on-prem Active Directory. So if you have a user here or a group here and you want to modify the test group membership here, and I want to add a couple of users, it would not let me do that, right? See, there's no option to add users. If you go here, members, it would not let me add users. Hopefully, if I'm right here, it will not let me even click add members here. You see, I am clicking here. It's not going to let me do that because this group is a sync group that has been brought from on-prem Active Directory. Same is with any identity that is synced. If you want to modify it, you have to modify it back in on-prem Active Directory. Going back to the groups, I'm going to create a new group here. So as we discussed, I'm going to create a group called here test read. And I forgot to mention one thing here. Even on the Azure AD roles, right, in past, in Azure AD roles, you could only add the user identities. There was no provision to add groups. Now you can add a group to the Azure AD roles. So this is the option, right? Azure AD roles can be assigned to the group, which is pretty cool. So instead of adding each user, you can have your own custom group created and say, let's say my organization name is 8365 or type TST. I can say 8365 TST global admin, and I have very limited number of users there, and I add that group into the Azure AD role, right? So that's the advantage here. Right now we are not using it for Azure AD role, so I'm gonna leave it as no. Assign membership, we are not adding any membership, we're just creating an empty group. Similarly, I create another group here and I call it as test owner. I think now this is the naming convention we use, right? And I have same thing, I'm not putting any description here, but you can, right? So test owner, test read, and then you can have a another one called as test contributor. Right, we have created 3 different groups: test contributor, test owner, test read. And you could do it in your Terraform, you could do it into your ARM template, however you want to do that. But let's just go and do it manually for the simplistic understanding. Test and access control item. This is very easily doable in Terraform when you're provisioning these resource group, right? So add role assignment, and I would say reader here, oh sorry, owner here first of all, and I will call it test. We're doing the owner here, and we save it, and we go again here, and this time we're gonna do the contributor here, and I'm gonna add the test contributor, save, and then one more here, called as reader here, and test read, save. Right, now this is all we need to do. Now if I go in view, it's very simplistic, right? Who is the owner? Chris White, we did it earlier. That is inherited from the subscription layer that we allowed him, if you recall back in our last video. And then we have me, which is also inherited from the subscription layer, and then the test owner and test read, right? Very simple, very simplistic, clean. And when I have seen organization which this Apple is like filled of individual users, like tons of them, and nobody knows who this user is, whether he is here, whether he left the company, not what not. So it just breaks your security structure or security principle of least privilege architecture, least privilege model. So please follow this model. This would help you have a better control. Now for an example, I have a group, let's say going back to the Azure Active Directory now, and I can create one more group, and this is the group that I have. This could be a sync group, right? I don't really have any problem with this, because this group is okay. If I say here, this group is called as app1, right? And now app1 is my application 1, which needs the contributor rights on test contributor group, right? So if I just go here, either I could do it manually here, which is one way of doing it, and I can add this member, and I can say test contributor select, and the moment I did that, it automatically, this whole team, the app1 team, got the contributor rights. Or we could use the self-service model that we're going to discuss down the road. Now, having said that, once you understand the basic fundamental concept here, if you go back into the resource groups here and the test, let's say this resource group would also have storage account. This resource group would have VMs. This maybe just to start with the storage, for example. So what we also have a possibility of adding a role here, and we can say from storage perspective, you'll see how many not the contributor. See here. So you have that. You need to decide that storage account backup contributor, storage account contributor, storage account key operator role, storage account storage blob data contributor. Depending on how your operation model is, now you can also think that what additional roles you would like to have, and based on that you can create a corresponding group, assign that assign that role to that group, and you're good to go, right? And that's a very straightforward thing. So in order to understand the model that I showed you in my slide deck, that you could go into the management group and wherever you can install. So there is no management group right now, except for the default one. I do have the rights to start using management group, and management group, create a new one. And this, obviously the management group would have subscriptions there, right? So we have created that management group here. I actually created two of them. Right now there is no subscription underneath it, but if you go here any detail, this is where you can assign. So as of now, what we have discussed, that the RBAC, or the role-based access control, allows or gives you the authorization to do certain things, right? Gives you permissions and rights. But what if you want to deny assignments? So what if you have given the rights at the resource level, a subscription layer, or something at a higher level, or a resource group, and to somebody, and then you don't want that particular person to have the rights on the lower resources? So you have the option to deny assignment, which is relatively new. I haven't got a chance to play with this a lot, but you have the option. Say, for an example, Bobby Malik has the rights on the resource group as a contributor rights or as an ownership right, and that is in him being inherited to all VMs and all other stuff. But because of any reason you do not want Bobby to have the rights on that VM, you could go ahead and deny assignment right here. I have to do some, I have to play with it. I have not done, this is relatively new. I think it was introduced about 4 or 5 months back, and I haven't got a chance to play with it. As well as, and I mentioned earlier that you can also add custom role, pretty straightforward. I showed you for Azure AD role. Similarly, you can also do that. You can create the custom role name, and let's say we call it AT365 TSD, and you can put a description here. You can clone it, and again you can start from scratch, or you can start from JSON, and then you can add the permissions, right? And you have got a lot of stuff built in here that you could take care of it, combine them together, and create your custom role. I have done it for one customer, but in general I haven't got a requirement to create multiple custom roles. Just one customer had some custom requirements, so we combined multiple things into one role and created the roles, right? So you could do that for different kind of resources here. Log analytics, you will see Bing search, all kind of resources here, right? So for example, if I try to do this, let's see if I can do it. So I want to create, use the keyboard, right? I can do for keyboard. I want to do for storage. I hope I can do that for storage, right? So log analytics and whatnot, right? You can continue looking into it, and you can combine it, and you can download all permissions and combine the different icons, create your custom role, and you're good to go. So you can do both. You can create custom roles, and you can also have the deny assignment if you need it, right? I'm almost sure that you might not need it, but in case you need it, right? All right, I think we have covered the authorization part from Azure Active Directory, role-based access control, Azure resource role-based access control. Obviously, there's a lot that needs to still be done in terms of other role-based access control that we discussed earlier for Kubernetes, from SQL, MySQL, Postgre, other COTS application that is beyond the scope of this demo right now. But I think I have on AKS somewhere, if I remember, I have that video, but that still needs to be done. But that gives you a fairly good idea how and what you should be doing when you are defining the authorization. Remember, one more time, again, I may sound like a broken record here, but use the least privilege model. Follow the zero trust architecture. This is the fundamental. Do not just go, and often what happens, this is again an issue, often what happens that people are in a rush to do things. Your application and developer teams would come, or your leadership would come and say, okay, let's do it this time, let's just make it happen, right? Let's give this guy the ownership right on the subscription or on the management group. We have to put our foot from the security perspective and say no to that, right? This is not acceptable. We are not going to do that. We are going to do the right way. We're going to provide you the least privilege model. If an application team needs access, we need to understand the logic and reason before they're asking the highly privileged role. So please do not bow to that request in the time basis. I have seen this happening in every single organization. Hey, there is a pressure, there is a strict timeline. Oh, I need an ownership right. Why do you need an ownership? I need to create this resource. Okay, you can create a resource without the ownership right. Why should I give you the ownership right? Right? You don't need an ownership right. You just need to create a resource. Okay, you can do it with a contributor right. Why would I give you ownership right? This has been an ongoing saga. Many of you have already seen it, and I may not sound like something new to you, but those folks who are new, you have to understand that you cannot just accommodate unwanted requests and still expect that your environment would follow the required compliance and security guidelines, the best practices. This is not going to happen. So my advice to you is ask questions before you grant any permissions to anybody and say, what is the logic? Why do we need to do that? And and then try to see, hey, what is the minimal rights that I need to give to this individual or this group? Then come out with your role-based access control model. Otherwise, within a matter of few months, you will see how much chaos it would create for you. I have seen environments that they're paying tons of money to Microsoft not just because it's a security violation and compliance issue, but now people have inadequate rights to do anything that they like in the environment, and you end up seeing resources that you never planned to be deployed in your environment. You see the VMs being deployed with the SKUs that you never planned to do. You see storage accounts created all over the places, right? And people are creating, and they are not doing something that they are intentionally doing. They think it's okay because they have the privilege to create a VM, or they have a privilege to create a storage account. They don't even realize that by creating that, this is creating a security problem, or it's creating a compliance problem, or it's adding cost to the organization for no reason. This is not something new. This is, I think, everyone that has worked in Azure or any cloud knows this very, very well. You have the ability, you have the time, you have the privilege to control that not to happen. It is you as a security administrator, as a compliance administrator, to control it, your right authorization model here. So good luck to you guys. I think this would conclude the session here, and we'll move into the next video around identity governance, which would be very exciting, which would continue this thought process here of using the privileged identity management. Thank you again, folks. Please continue watching. Please, if you have not watched my other videos, go to YouTube and you will find a lot of other videos that may be of interest to you, may help you in your task that you're doing it. Keep safe, stay safe, stay away from COVID, and have a great day, great evening, great night, whatever part of the world you are. Bye-bye.